Compliance Kitchen podcast. This is Sylvia, and today I want to take a look at a recent guidance that was issued in the EU. This concerns due diligence in the context of forced labor in supply chains. So on July 13, the Commission and the European External Action Service published guidance on due diligence to help EU companies identify and address and mitigate risks of forced labor in their supply chains. The guidance is kind of following up on the recently published EU trade policy that listed responsible supply chains as one of its headline actions. The release notes that the guidance also delivers on a number of the priorities of the EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy in the area of business and human rights. And those priorities include the eradication of forced labor and the promotion of internationally recognized due diligence standards. So the guidance discusses due diligence as well as tools that are available to businesses in this regard. The EU has, as I'm sure you are aware, the EU has already put in place some mandatory standards in some sectors of its industry. It continues to push for international standards on responsible business conduct, and I will say that the guidance only addresses due diligence as concerns forced labor in supply chains, so it's not looking at other supply chain risks. And looking at the guidance itself, I've picked some considerations for forced labor, starting with policies and management systems that should be tailored to the risk of forced labor. This should include stipulating a zero tolerance policy for forced labor, accompanied with policies that explain how forced labor may arise in the supply chain, for example, in relation to recruitment and retention practices, subcontracting, use of state-sponsored forced labor or recruitment agencies, and so forth. The policy, which this is not a surprise, and the systems should clarify that, of course, suppliers and staff will not face retributions if they report instances of forced labor or increased risks of forced labor. The guidance walks us through some risk factors for forced labor, commonly referred to as red flags, to consider when you are scoping supply and value chains as part of your due diligence. And so these would be country risk factors, so countries that have not ratified fundamental conventions or have a weak record of human rights protections would be a red flag, or countries that are have state-orchestrated programs, including mass mobilization for large-scale national development programs, or labor or vocational programs that are targeted at persons who belong to some minorities, let's say religious or ethnic minorities, or let's say the legal regime is outlawing peaceful strike actions. Countries that have poor prison policies and programs would be red flag. If you are unable to conduct in-depth risk assessment, that should be your red flag as well. Employment of migrant workers, workers without employment contracts, in particular in jurisdictions where employment contract is something that is normally given to a worker, or you have a presence of informally employed workers or children and adolescents in the workplace. That's a huge red flag. Same thing for workers recruited through government recruiters, for example. You should take a close look at that. You may have risk factors linked to debt. So, for example, there is existence of credit arrangements and debt schemes for workers, or let's say the workers are not able to freely dispose of their wages, or they don't have access to their government-issued ID or passports. You can have violence, harassment, or even physical abuse. So all these are red flags that you should be looking for when you are conducting due diligence in your supply chains. And then, of course, you should be strengthening these checks according to the risk area that you're looking at, carrying out more in-depth assessments of recruiting agencies, for example, request interviews of workers in a secure environment without the presence of their managers, ensure that you can have independent, unannounced access to the work site so that you can conduct surprise audits to see what the working conditions are. So those would be some of the examples that I kind of picked out from the guidance as to the due diligence pointers, I guess. There's, of course, a whole lot more there, and including considerations for responsible disengagement from your business partner if you can't get answers to all these questions that we touched on, or if you believe that there is a forced labor situation and you need to disengage, separate your business from that business partner, and also some considerations for remediation, how to remediate forced labor finding when you get to that point. So the guidance, again, it's a guidance, so this is not a legal requirement yet. However, because EU is pushing for international standards, it would not surprise me if we will see a mandate, a blanket mandate sometime soon. I will say that I'm expecting to see legislation on sustainable corporate governance as well in the near future, which will presumably mandate due diligence by EU companies to mitigate and prevent the negative sustainability impacts in their operations and supply chains. So this will kind of dovetail into the human rights violations. So I would say that this is an area to definitely watch because it is developing. And like I said, it won't surprise me if we will see some mandatory requirements on EU businesses come out of this.